Private rented housing is the worst condition housing that we have in the UK. Young people saying, I'm handing over half my salary to pay off somebody else's mortgage, and I'm living in a mouldy, damp flat with a gas boiler that hasn't been serviced for years.
We have to, as a society, take a much more responsible approach to actually housing the nation.
So mass provision of affordable housing is not going to be available in this current model. It's just not going to work.
I'm Hannah Previtt.
And I'm Dominic O'Connell.
And this is our new podcast from The Times and The Sunday Times,
where we bring the kind of behind-the-scenes conversations we're normally having with people in business to you every week.
Picking apart one big business story with guests from the front line.
This is The Business.
And our business today is housing and a sector called build to rent. Is that the answer to the housing crisis? Could they fill the enormous gap? Or is the UK's love of owning bricks and mortar just too strong? Helen Gordon, Chief Executive of Grainger, will join us shortly to explain more.
I'm really looking forward to talking to Helen. She's great fun and knows all there is to know about property, having been an executive and a leading executive in it for a long time now. Ever since she actually studied it and went on to become an executive. And politically, this is a really important time for housing. It's one of Labour's top political priorities is to solve the housing crisis, which not many governments have managed to do, and no governments really have managed to do. But to set out the context for us, to set out the challenge really, we're joined by another woman who knows an awful lot about property, Melissa York from the Bricks and Mortar section of the Times and the Sunday Times. Melissa, welcome to The Business. Do you like our fantastic studio?
Yeah, it's very fancy. Look at it.
It is quite fancy. All done with lights, apparently. So just in terms of Labour's housing targets, Angela Rayner made her farewell speech in Parliament yesterday. She was the one who was largely leading the push on housing. Just tell us, what are Labour's housing targets and how do they compare with what's happened recently?
So they are 1.5 million homes over this parliamentary term. So that'll be over 5 years. That's their goal. The previous Conservative government's goal, just for a comparison, were 1 million. And so I think in practice, that means around 300,000 homes to be built a year. To be fair to the Conservatives, they did actually achieve 1 million homes over that Parliament, but obviously that kind of accumulated towards the end of their parliamentary term, because you have to have planning permission in place in order to start building right away. And at the moment, we just don't have the planning permissions to build 300,000 homes a year.
When did the UK last build 300,000 homes in a year?
I don't think since about 1970. And obviously we built even more than 300,000 new homes a year before that, because we had a huge post-war building boom from the Clement Attlee government of 1945 when they built tons and tons of social housing. And you saw this in a lot of countries, particularly obviously in Europe, that have been heavily bombed after the war. I think at the time, Labour's manifesto promised homes fit for heroes. That was like one of their big slogans. So yeah, there was a huge political push to build more homes, to rebuild our cities.
I hate to show my age, but I remember working for the construction trade press in the late 80s. And those were in the days when councils still had their own building operations, what were called DLOs, direct labour organisations, and going to Bradford and standing on a picket line where they were trying to abolish it. But that kind of mass scale, public owned and public directed level of investment and state investment, that was what was required for 300,000 homes a year. That's not what we're talking about now, is it?
No, not at all. And several things have happened since to make that almost impossible, really. I mean, Right to Buy was, the huge policy that changed that overnight. And what was baked into Right to Buy was that local councils could no longer choose how they spent the profits of those receipts. So they had to basically use most of it to pay down their debt, which was great because lots of councils became debt-free as a result of selling off their housing. But it also meant that they couldn't raise the capital to build more housing. And it largely conceded house building over to the private sector, to private businesses. And when you're trying to solve a housing crisis without, as you said, a kind of big state-backed government building, it becomes very difficult to get those numbers up because it has to work economically. It has to turn a profit in order for companies to be interested in coming in and building it in the first place.
And so obviously now Labour's trying to solve the problem. Where does build to rent come into all of this?
So build to rent is, probably quite an inaccessible name for what is essentially renting in a building where the whole building is full of renters, and you have a management company that does all of your repairs on site and probably has a concierge. And you can go, and instead of having to phone up your landlord and say, my oven's broken, can you get me a new one? You can just pop downstairs to the concierge and tell them, and they would come up and do all the repairs and maintenance. But behind it is a big institutional investor. So rather than having, a landlord who might have bought their first flat in London in the 80s, and now they've bought a family house and maybe have a couple of other investments up north, it's not kind of a person as such that is your landlord. It is a big company. It's a big institutional investor. And they're normally, at the moment, they're getting lots of investment from huge banks, like Lloyd's. I know Goldman Sachs have invested, pension funds. So essentially, it means that you're still a renter. You've still got a landlord, but the landlord is a big company instead of just one guy.
This is a fantastic thing for pension funds in particular, isn't it? Because they have long-term liabilities. They're looking after the retirement plans that run for 30 years. They're looking for an asset that matches that kind of liability. Build to rent absolutely fits that, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of tenants perhaps don't realise, and when they go into these things, they have to sign up to rent increases every year. They're linked to inflation normally, like CPI usually. But not always. And obviously, that's a really solid return for an investor. It means your investment's going to keep up with inflation indefinitely. And that's very, very attractive for a lot of people. Also, the supply and demand here is completely out of whack. So, they're going to be there's always going to be huge demand for any kind of rental product in the UK for years and years to come because of the challenges that we spoke about before in terms of building enough.
And what about the renters? So who are they usually? What's the kind of target demographic for these types of properties? And also, I believe you've been inside some of them. So paint us a bit of a picture of what they're like.
Yeah, one of the big snagging points at the moment for this to be like a really popular mass scale product is the fact it's quite unaffordable for a lot of people for quite valid economic reasons. These aren't kind of huge companies in the UK at the moment. They've got high land costs, they've got high building costs, labour shortages. So it just means that at the moment it's slightly above market rate, normally between 10 and 30% more expensive than your average rental. And because of this, it means that it's only at the moment appealing to either people that are here kind of in a transient way, but earn a good wage. So basically corporate relocations, people that might be here to work for a bank for 3 months or something, or international students. A lot of them are being built next to university campuses and around kind of that because they know that's the sort of thing they like. And so at the moment, that's who it's really, really appealing to. But increasingly, we're getting build-to-rent houses, so what they call single-family units, and that, I think, is where the big domestic market is here. It's for families that need that space, but they're not finding it within the private rented sector because a lot of them are being turned into house shares and flat shares with multiple bedrooms. So we're getting big housing estates now that are all rentals, and I think actually that's where most of the growth is probably going to be in the future. All of those kind of flats that are targeting those kind of affluent young professionals, I think that, that's kind of maxing out its appeal. One of the reasons that they charge this rent, obviously, but they want to drag people in with high flashy amenities to make it seem as though this higher rent is really worth the money. So I've been to build to rent developments where they have doggy grooming parlors on the bottom floor, and they're all pet friendly usually because that's kind of a big selling point to people. Padel courts, they'll have gyms almost as standard, big flashy kind of nice swimming pools and spas. They'll have co-working spaces almost certainly because they know that these kind of like digital nomads would like to work there as well. They're exactly their target customer. So yeah, that's at the moment they're selling that higher rent with flashy amenities. But this is where John Lewis, I think, is quite interesting, is that John Lewis is trying to have a cheaper, more mass market product without flashy amenities. But what they will drag people in with is their brand name and their customer service. So they'll say, you can trust us. We'll fill your fridge with Waitrose goods from downstairs, because a lot of them are going to be on top of Waitrose supermarkets. And so there are different products coming through now that are getting a bit more interesting.
Anecdotally, you hear that the Renters' Rights Bill and other changes mean that the kind of landlords that dominate rented property in the UK are dropping out. They find it a bit of a hassle, so they are selling up. Could the build to rent companies fill that gap?
Yes, and I think increasingly they are. I think the whole sector is becoming much more professionalised, which isn't a bad thing. Private rented housing is the worst condition housing that we have in the UK, because we don't have the same regulations that you would have in place for social housing. So, increasingly you hear, young people saying, I'm handing over half my salary every month to pay off somebody else's mortgage, and I'm living in a mouldy, damp flat with, a gas boiler that hasn't been serviced for years. So, if we can move away from that to a more professionalised model with more accountability, whether that's to shareholders or, great, obviously it's a fantastic thing. I think that some of those people that are selling up now are doing so because they're being more heavily taxed and regulated.
And on the landlord side, it can be a complete hassle as well, can't it? My husband used to own a property in Lincoln where he'd gone to university, and there was just perpetual issues. The tenants were trashing the place. It was often students. And I think, particularly given the Renters' Rights Bill as well, it's just frankly more hassle than it's worth in terms of rental income for these kind of private landlords.
That's because he wasn't providing doggy grooming.
Yeah, what can he expect? He's not providing doggy grooming.
Well, listen, Melissa, you have set the scene really well. It's a difficult problem for Labour. And let's now talk to someone who can perhaps tell us if that build-to-rent sector is going to fill the gap.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you for having me.
Helen Gordon, Chief Executive of Grainger, is our guest today on The Business. Helen, welcome to our studio. What do you think of it?
I love it. I love the bull and the bear. It's brilliant.
Helen, as Dominic alluded to earlier, you've had a rather glittering career. So give us a sense of how you've got to where you are now.
So I started off qualifying as a chartered surveyor and have done numerous jobs in investment and in banking and in construction. I've worked in the corporate sector, and then I now run Grainger PLC.
Tell us a bit about Grainger and what it was that attracted you to working for Grainger, leading Grainger, and what it does differently to some of its counterparts.
So I suppose the genesis of that was actually when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister and sort of during the global financial crisis said, what will it take to get the institutions to invest in homes for rent or housing generally? And at the time, I was with Legal & General, and Sir Bob Kerslake, who was heading up the civil service at the time, asked me whether I'd look at what it would take. And as I looked at it as an opportunity, I thought, this is absolutely crazy. Why don't we have long-term pension funds and investment companies looking at investing in residential? And, it was right in front of our faces, because how many people do buy-to-let for their pension? That's why a lot of people invest in it. And when Grainger came to see me, it is the UK's largest listed residential landlord. They asked me if I'd like to be chief exec, and we pivoted the strategy just to concentrate on new build to rent. And it was a burgeoning sector at the time, and we've delivered about 2.8 billion in terms of housing over the last 9 years.
Can you just give us an overview of how many units you have, who rents them, who builds them, crucially?
We have over 11,500 operational units, operational homes. We have another pipeline of about 5,000. We are building throughout the UK, very much research-led in terms of where demand are, and we work with contractors to build them. So we don't do our own building, and we're building in London with Vistry and Bouygues and people like that, and then we're building in the regions. We've built with people like Wilmot Dixon and regional contractors.
So in terms of growth aspiration, obviously 11,500 is substantial, but you want to do more faster, right? So what is the aspiration?
The demand for homes in the UK is such that I can see 40,000 was our aspiration, but I can see it getting much bigger than that.
And we were hearing from Melissa just now about her experience of build to rent properties. Can you give us a sense of who perhaps might live in one of the Grainger properties and what experience they can expect from being there?
I was teasing Melissa on the way out, actually, and so you've got to come and have a look at one of ours, because they're really lovely homes, but they're not the flashy swimming pools, padel courts and things like that. We always do have a gym because we've got a real commitment to health and well-being. We always have somewhere where we can convene the community, and we aim at the age group, which is really sort of 24. We limit our students to less than 10%, just because they don't put down roots in the same way. And the main age group is therefore early 20s to late 30s, but of course we rent to all age groups. And on average, they're paying about 28% of their income on rent, and we do all of our own leasing and we do all of our own management, and so we can really get to know people from the moment they look on our website and apply to go into a Grainger home.
What do they expect if it's not the the kind of doggy yoga facilities? What is it that they're really looking for in a home? Because I presume really good Wi-Fi is probably at the top of the list.
You're spot on. So we do super fast broadband into everybody's home. So that's not into the building and shared, so that everybody has it. And we always joke in the office that people would rather the roof blow off than the Wi-Fi go down, on the basis that it's just an essential part of life.
Brits are conditioned, I think, to own our own homes. In my case, it was certainly something that my parents always wanted for me. My husband's family came from India. It's all about owning your own home. Is that something that you're up against kind of culturally, societally, or do you think it's changing perhaps to reflect more what we see in Europe, in Germany, for example?
Yeah, you're again spot on Germany. The people rent for most of their working career and then buy towards the end of their career. And in the US, people will rent readily, and that is really a function of having a great rental market. I think a lot of people want home ownership for a variety of reasons, but one of them is so that they can control the quality and also how long they can stay there, so they feel as though they have more control over their lives. But actually renting with a professional landlord means that our teams are all incentivized that people stay with us and stay with us for longer. And so it's one of the things we measure ourselves on, which when you think it's a population that's going in there that are really, they're doing all of the things. If you think early 20s, late 30s, they're forming relationships and friendships, and they're unforming relationships and friendships, and they're settling down and they're starting families and all of those sort of things. So you would expect that to have a high degree of churn. But in fact, people do stay with us a long time.
And is the idea, therefore, that they would rent with you perhaps for 10 years and then they'd move out to the countryside and extend their families? Is that a kind of natural path?
Well, I think historically you would have expected home ownership to start with, a very small flat and then a bigger flat, and then, eventually you buy your family home or whatever. And I think now the frictional costs of buying and the barriers to saving for a deposit mean that it happens a lot later. But people are doing really great in their career. This is, if you think of early 20s to late 30s, it's where their career is really moving along, and they should have somewhere good to live.
And as you pointed out, this is a growing sector. But as we heard from Melissa just now, there is a housing crisis. So perhaps it's not growing quite quickly enough. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing from a Grainger point of view that are preventing you from building, frankly, as quickly as perhaps you'd like to?
So we do build quickly, and I'll give you an example of this. On one of our sites, which is a site in Manchester, we did 8 years supply in 18 months because the demand for letting is so strong that we know we can let all of those buildings, and the decision that an individual takes to rent a home is very different from the one that they do to buy a home. Your main point is, what are the barriers for us? Planning, which the government have said that they want to solve planning. Planning's a big one. But I think it's quite glib to say it's just planning. It's also things like access to water, access to power, and also access to finance, and then construction costs have gone up quite a lot.
Just on the planning point, the problem with planning always seems to me is that national government wants to do something about it, but planning is always a local issue, isn't it? It's the people who don't want it in their backyard.
Yeah.
Do you think that planning issue will actually be sorted?
Obviously, we have the democratic process in the planning process, and you've got to, and it's one of the reasons why the government looking at new towns as well, and the democratic process around new towns, where historically they had planning powers. But I think you're always going to have to go through there. But I think there's a realization now that for a lot of people, whether you're people with grown-up children living at home, that you realise that people are starting families later because they can't feel that they're settled in a home. I think that we have to, as a society, take a much more responsible approach to actually housing the nation. And I think the sort of a less parochial approach. And, I live in London, I live in central London. I'm fortunate to own a home. But right next to me, there are rental homes, there's social housing, and that's the fabric of London. But for a lot of the country, that's not necessarily the case. So I think we've just got to be accepting of the fact that we are going to need to build to house the nation.
Near where I live in London, in Peckham, they're planning to build an 800 home development. I think it is a build to rent development on top of a supermarket and shopping centre, which is an absolute eyesore, no architectural merit whatsoever. And guess what? There's a local campaign led by two well-known comedians to stop it, and it is probably going to be stopped. But so it's very difficult to actually do these things, isn't it? It
is really challenging, and I think one of the differences between build to rent and build for sale is the fact that when I talk to local authorities, I always say, we are going to be in your community. We're 113 years old as a company. We're going to be in your community for a long, long time. So we can build a relationship. We don't want to force this through. We're not going to build them, sell them, move on to the next one. Mm. And so we can sort of really get under the skin of what that community needs. And so we're providing things like, health centres, community facilities, all sorts of things, which mean that we don't want our communities to be an island in the middle of a wider community. And I think people really appreciate that.
Just on affordability, you gave that 28% figure, but that 28% figure is of the salaries of the people who rent your properties, aren't they? So they're probably better off people anyway. No, there are going to be lots of people who can't afford these properties. So
the average household income for two sharers would be in the region of 52 to 60,000. So that's the sort of...
And what about affordable targets from the local authorities? What targets are typically put on you for affordable places, and what does affordable mean?
So it's, the planning rule is 20% to 20% discount, but we also have our own registered provider, which means that we do significantly cheaper rents as well. And we manage those, and we don't believe in poor doors. So we manage those as if they...
What's a poor door?
A poor door is quite a lot of developments will have really brilliant, purpose built, and then they'll do the social housing at a much lower specification, right. And it's really obvious who's living where. We don't do that, and we share amenities, and we build a community, and some people just happen to be paying less.
There's talk of a plan to slash the minimum affordable housing requirements for new builds in order to spur new construction. Is that something you would welcome? Would it make your life easier?
I think the one thing that people haven't really cottoned onto is just how much heavy lifting the house building sector has had to do in the delivery of social housing. So I think you asked most of the question about when was the last big housing boom. It was actually post-war. And one of the things that we've lost is the the ability for the public sector to deliver housing. The housing associations are in quite a difficult position because they've got legacy assets and they've got lots of repairs and backlog maintenance to sort out. And so the fact that there is an expectation that only the private sector can provide the affordable housing that goes along with it is actually really not understood in terms of the economics. And so in order to help this with a consortium of others, including contractors and quantity surveyors and house builders, we actually built a model, and you can toggle literally anywhere in the country. You can see house prices, you can actually see the affordable rent limit, and you could see how many houses you would have to sell at that level to work out to support some affordable rental homes. And I think the sooner we just accept that actually as a nation we have to invest in the affordable sector, and the house builders and the private for rent builders will do their bit, but they can't do all the heavy lifting.
So mass provision of affordable housing is not going to be available in this current model. It's just not going to work.
It's not going to work on the back of private for sale, and it's a shame, because you get into a room with the Secretary of State or whatever, with the house builders, and they say, tell me one thing you'd fix, and everyone says planning. But under that heading of planning is also that point about how much affordable housing you can do. And in London, the mayor was looking for 50% affordable housing. Well, London's one of the most expensive areas to build in. Land prices are high, construction costs are high. And it wasn't a surprise to me that at the start of this year, we'd gone through 2 quarters. There's 33 boroughs in London, and 23 of them hadn't built a single home. And that's not a surprise, because the model just doesn't work. So I think we have to look at it.
What might be an appropriate level for London?
I think it depends where you are and what else you want from the scheme, because there's also resistance in London to a lot of high value homes that are sold to overseas, and so you've got to look at the whole economic picture of a development. But sort of 20%, 25%, and also allowing the London boroughs to use their council house receipts in order to invest in, sort of grant for new social homes would be good. After all, they pick up the bill at the end of the day. And I think the figures and the statistics of, how much we're spending on temporary housing for young families is frightening. And I think there's a new figure out this week that was over 170,000 children are living in temporary accommodation. And I think we as just owe it to that next generation to look at this and say, we can't keep trying to do the same thing and it'll work.
What's the Renters' Rights Bill going to do to your business? Do you welcome it, or are you a bit worried about it?
Well, we've worked quite hard with the government to help them to understand the sort of really the things that we should put right in the, and Section 21, which is the big no-fault eviction, which a lot of small landlords wanted. We're a supporter of, because you just heard me say that we want people to stay with us for longer. The only thing is, a professional landlord would only usually use Section 21 because the courts were quite slow. So if you had a really disruptive resident, or you had someone not paying rent for a long time, to get through the court system takes quite a long time. So people would use Section 21 as a method there. We have had commitments from the government that they are going to improve it. But we've gone through every process within our business, and we've actually changed them to reflect the Renters' Rights Bill. But I'm very fortunate, because we started, I joined the business as CEO in 2016, and our main pipeline has been developed since 2017. And as a result of that, it's energy efficient, it's modern, we have good customer practices, we are pet friendly. And so all the things that are in the Renters' Rights Bill have quite a strong alignment to how Grainger does business anyway.
The bill, though, doesn't include this idea of a rent tribunal. which will judge whether you're actually charging a market rate or not.
Yes.
Some commentators have said, well, actually, that is really opening the door to rent controls eventually by another route. Are you a bit worried that actually might insert an element of control of external control?
We've had reassurances. I mean, one of the things for me is that we will always work with our residents, and we always benchmark. We mark to market of what local rents are doing in any event, and we have so much information and data that we'll be able to pull together. This is the market rent, and I think we don't have a lot of resistance at the moment in terms of our rental increases. So I'm expecting that if the tribunal works well and efficiently, that we'll be fine. The other thing that we've done recently, we've converted to a REIT, a real estate investment trust, and that means that anyone investing with us, their dividend is taxed in their hand rather than not in our hands. And so for small buy-to-let landlords, if they still love the sector, they don't want the management hassle, and they don't want the sort of everything that comes with it. They still can get the same return through investing with Grainger. And of course, if they put it in their ISA, they can even get it tax-free.
Just in terms of, I'm quite interested in the financing of it. So we do have this big gap. Grainger by itself can't possibly fill it. But how can you raise more money to deploy more money? You can't just, I assume you're not going to do a big rights issue or anything like that. But where does the finance come from?
Well, we have historically, we did at the start of the strategy, we sold a lot of our non-core assets, and we also did a rights issue for growth, which was incredibly well supported.
We should explain what a rights issue is. You're selling new shares to existing investors.
Raising new equity by selling shares. We have within our portfolio, because Grainger was around for a long time, we have about 1 billion of non-core assets which we're recycling through. So that's land and older properties, and we recycle through those and we invest in our pipeline. But generally, the bond market has been very supportive. So we have our balance sheet is very strong, and we have at the outbreak of the Ukraine war, we fixed our interest for 7 years in the mid threes, so we have a nice cost of debt. And so, but I think again, because of those underlying fundamentals, the banks have always been very willing to lend to this sector, as indeed have the institutions through the bond market.
But if a big institution wants to invest in this kind of thing, BlackRock comes along, which it has done actually, and done some stuff in residential.
Yes.
But say BlackRock comes along and says, listen, we've got 2 billion quid, we want to put it to work. Can they give it to Grainger?
So they are one of our investors, and you've seen people invest through the equity of the company, and we've also seen people invest in the sector directly, or indeed in joint ventures and consortiums. So actually, there's numerous ways they can come in, depending on how much they want to be involved in either the development process or the management process, or just be, sort of passive and take the sort of dividend yield.
Just to go back on that point, why historically had pension funds not done that obvious thing you thought, you made the connection yourself, and other fund managers as well? Were they frightened of construction risk or planning risk?
No, actually, they were frightened of customers. And I have a really big thing about this, which is that, if you have the role of looking after people's homes, people's lives, it's very challenging to make sure everything goes right all the time. And, if you've got a brand like Legal & General or Aviva or whatever, the real worry is that you're on watchdog because somebody's tap hasn't been mended, and actually it's a whole destruction for your whole brand. I think also the fact that in the 80s, because historically they had owned a lot of residential, in the 80s we had rent control, 70s and 80s, and that actually meant that and we had a high inflationary environment, and rent wasn't keeping up with because of that control. And so I think that was one of the reasons. But this government and previous governments have given assurances that they won't introduce rent controls.
So returning to the theme from the top of the show, the housing crisis, and as you outlined so powerfully there, how can build to rent be part of the solution?
I think it's speed of delivery. I think that we at Grainger have been quite fortunate because we've worked very well with the public sector. So we've got 7 public sector partnerships with the likes of TfL, Network Rail, Canal and Rivers Trust, the Defence Estates, and so releasing public land and building homes for rent is one way that it could happen. But I think that there is a weight of capital out there willing to invest in this sector, and also when people spend time in the build to rent property, and we've got someone interning with us this week, and so one part of it was to go and see it. And the first question is, would you live here? Absolutely. It's sort of for people to see that as being having a nice rental home as aspirational rather than a meanwhile home.
You spoke earlier about kind of careers. We were talking about careers and skills and seeing careers in construction. What I'm really personally interested in, and please do indulge me because I hate it when you ask women questions that you perhaps wouldn't ask a man.
We did the gender pay gap episode last week.
We did the gender pay gap episode last week, and I wrote my column about it for the newspaper last Sunday as well, and about female breadwinners. So how have you prospered in such a male-dominated environment? Is it just from being brilliant, or have you had to have quite sharp elbows as well along the way?
I think one of the things has been clearly in an environment which is so male-dominated. You can sort of stand back a little bit, but then I've been fortunate in being often the only woman in the room or in a business, and so therefore you do get some attention. And when you get that attention, I think the important thing is to be heard with your ideas and with your thoughts. I think the other thing that women often do in business is that they don't believe in themselves, and I think they often don't make the moves. And so I've made some pretty brave moves. So after 10 years with John Lang, I think I was the first female director, and I think that it was a family business, although it was listed, and I think they felt that I would be there for forever. But I was curious about doing something else, and I think that move, that curiosity and that volunteering to take on the stuff that everybody thinks is a really sticky job, and then actually delivering on it is one of the I always say, be curious and be courageous. That is the best advice you can give for women in business.
I love that. That's a great mantra.
We should probably finish on a housing note, because we started out talking about Labour's challenge to 300,000 homes. 2 questions really. Do you think they'll hit that 300,000 a year, or 1.5 million over the life of the Parliament? And let's that one first. Do you think they've got any chance of getting to that 1.5 million?
I think the sort of the advice of the industry is that they won't get to the 1.5 million, but I would like to think that they could get to that 300,000 run rate. And if they do, I think they should really be congratulated for doing that. And I think you've got to remember, it's not necessarily, you have to think of it in the context of what's happening economically. And, you've both been talking about, interest rates for, sort of last couple of years and how many cuts and things like that. We have got an environment which has meant that the house builders haven't been producing as much. We have got an environment where it's harder for businesses like mine to raise equity, etc. And so in that economic context, I think if they get to 300,000 a year run rate by pulling all the levers, then I think they should be congratulated. I heard from Angela Rayner, and I heard it again from Steve Reed, that they both feel that they have to deliver this. And I think that is one really important thing, that we've got the political leadership willing to do.
So if they get to that 300,000 a year by the end of the Parliament, that'll be a tick in the box.
It will. And I think then it gives them or anybody that comes after them the legacy and the infrastructure to keep going at that rate.
Helen, you've been very generous with your time. You've actually led us really nicely through the pitfalls of the housing industry and the build to rent industry as well, and a big challenge for Labour coming up to get to that 300,000 a year. But thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been great.
It's been such a pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So Hannah, you asked Helen Gordon there of Grainger how she'd done so well and what was a male-dominated industry. I think actually she demonstrated why she has. She's really smart and she's really nice and she just has great answers to stuff. She's just really capable. And also I thought her diagnosis of Labour's housing targets was very good. The idea that mass social housing is not going to happen unless it's provided by the public sector. She talked about going back to when councils were building houses, and that the whole model of doing it through asking the private sector to provide affordable housing as part of their developments doesn't really work if you want to provide mass social housing. And also this idea that even though Labour may not hit this 1.5 million homes over the life of the Parliament, if they get to 300,000 a year by the end of the Parliament, I think people will probably cut them a bit of slack. If we are building 300,000 homes a year nationally by the end of the Parliament, then I think people will judge that job done.
Mm-hmm. And unsurprisingly, when we had the kind of NIMBY discussion, she was saying that perhaps some of us need to be a little bit less parochial, I think was the word she used.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that is the big problem for planning, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Planning is they're trying to change it at a national level, but there's always a council which is beholden to a group of voters who wants to say, I don't want this development right next to me.
Absolutely. And we've got it in my village in Essex at the moment. They're trying to build new homes. And I think it's the size of the village that's already standing again and would effectively join up two villages. And you can imagine the locals are absolutely up in arms about it.
Well, and Helen, of course, was heavily involved with Labour's work on new towns. Mm-hmm. I think that's a huge test of Labour's resolve around providing the right number of houses. If they can get the new towns through planning, then actually life gets a lot easier. And
one of the things I also really liked towards the end there is she also brought it back to the real human level, the fact that there's 170,000 children, being born and brought up in such awful surroundings in the rental sector. I think, perhaps as parents also kind of brings it home.
Well, exactly. And if councils could build houses again, if they were empowered to build houses instead of paying out for rental accommodation or substandard hotel accommodation, it seems a fairly sensible thing to do, but politically a very difficult thing to do.
I must say, as somebody who rented in London all the way up until the age of 32, when I moved out of London to be nearer my family and we had our first daughter, we rented a pretty average basement flat without much light in Hackney that cost an absolute arm and a leg. And the landlord was okay, but everything was very slow if something went wrong. Would I be convinced to live in one of her buildings if I was at that stage of my life now? Yeah, probably.
Well, I think you'd want to. The bigger question, though, is that can build to rent fill the gap and provide lots more rental housing? And I think Helen didn't really even try to pretend that it could. To be honest, it's still quite small. It's growing. It's answering a great question. How do you get these big lumps of money that are held in pension funds invested in assets that are absolutely ideal for them? She made that case really well, and that's why she went to Grainger, as she said. But the idea that they're suddenly going to become so big that they're going to fill in all this 90-odd%, which are actually provided by small landlords, I don't think there's any chance of that happening. I don't think she thinks there's any chance of that happening.
Absolutely. So I think what the point she was making is that it's a piece in a much bigger puzzle, right?
And that the professionalisation of it, as Melissa was telling us earlier, is probably a good thing, and the Renters' Rights Bill might actually speed that up.
Yeah, and it could just kind of elevate levels of professionalisation across the sector as well if they're competing with the likes of Grainger, right?
Yeah, so your Hackney landlord might actually
have to up his game.
Have to up his game, exactly. I'm Dominic O'Connell.
And I'm Hannah Previtt.
And this is The Business. Please get in touch. Let us know what you think of the show, and you can email us at thebusiness@thetimes.com. We do want to know what you think and what you want us to cover. And please do subscribe to this podcast on YouTube. Also, you can do it on your podcast app, of course. Then you'll get a notification as soon as we've got another episode out.
And we'll be back with you next week. Bye until then.
Bye.